Do you believe what we just sang? Is it hard for you to believe those things? Life is hard. Thank you. Life is hard. And it's the hard times of life that help us to know that God is real. My name is Lisa Hamilton. I'm on the pastoral team here at Christ Church, and I think I can speak for everybody in saying that we really care about you. We really care how you're dealing with the challenges in your life and what happens to you. One of those challenges is likely to be loss in your life in one way or another. And how do we respond to loss? What do we do when something terrible happens? In our small groups this week, we're studying the chapter called Enlarge Your Soul Through Grief and Loss. What? Enlarge your soul? How can loss and grief enlarge my soul? Think about it. Logically, if you lose something, you have less of that thing, right? If I lose 1,000 pesos, I have 1,000 pesos less in my pocket. I can do 1,000 pesos less worth of things. If I lose my keys, I have fewer ways to get into my house. If I lose, I have less. That's the logic. Loss, grief and loss shrink us up unless we process it well. And here's the way God always works. Something that's supposed to be a negative thing or a bad or a difficult thing can become something good, something helpful, something enlarging for me. To grieve is to process, to allow the loss to do its work, to grow, to learn, to expand, to become the person that God has designed us to be. In God's presence, there are always good purposes beyond our current experience, for others and for ourselves. Sometimes what happens to us and our response to that thing isn't for us or isn't for us only. It's for other people and what God is doing in them as they live through these things with us. There is nothing like death to help us consider our life, to clarify our values, to know what matters. John's cousin, Rosemary, died this week, and at her funeral, another relative said to us, "Hey, let's get everybody together. Let's get all the relatives together at a different location. Let's find a way to meet and to be family in a different way than just at a cemetery." Death is a part of life. It often takes us by surprise. Our own death, each one of us will die one day. They say that's what we all have in common. We all will die one day, but also the death of people in our lives. And I know that our community has suffered the death of many people during these past years. But we also experience the loss in other kinds of death. Our dreams, our expectations, a change in our plans, a loss of a friendship or of a marriage, or saying goodbye. What kinds of death have you experienced this year? What kinds of loss have you experienced this year in moving, in changing jobs, in changing friendships, What kinds of limits have you experienced? Health? Time? Not understanding or not being understood? That's a limit. That's an existential limit. I wish I could do more. I wish I could be more. But we can't. We are limited as human beings. Yesterday we had a TCK debrief. A TCK is a third culture kid. That means a child who grows up outside their parents' passport country. And so we had a debrief, helping our children to learn how to process their grief and their loss, how to recognize their loss. Almost all the children at our church are TCKs. We did this first workshop in English. We'll do another one in Spanish. So all of our children will have these tools. Some of us are immigrants. We decided to, or we were forced to leave our country. And there's much death and much loss related to that. Some of us are mobile families. We live for a few years in different countries around the world. And this is a great adventure, but it also creates grief and loss, especially affecting our children as they're growing up. Their developmental years include all of these changes, which we as adults live, but we live in a different way. And so, grief is a natural part of life. Yesterday in the TCK workshop, we talked about hidden losses. Things we lose without really realizing it, like we lose hearing other languages. We lose smells that are familiar to us, or food that we love so much, or music that we really appreciate or that we really enjoy. We lose doing what our family or our friends are doing. What are your families doing on Sunday afternoon, wherever you're from? We're not there. Loss of visiting relatives. This week is Thanksgiving in the U.S. I would love to have all of my children and my grandchildren come to my house for a weekend. My grandson, Cyrus, is 1 year old today. I'll see him, but I won't be with him. I can't give him a hug. I can't play with him. I mean, I can play on the cell phone, but that's not the same. Loss, limits, and grief. Any kind of death or loss requires and needs process. Needs to be worked out. It needs to be felt. It needs to be understood and verbalized. Grief should be our natural response. So what happens with unprocessed grief? Unprocessed grief can cause illness, can cause pain because our body speaks what our minds want to ignore or deny or avoid, can cause nightmares, addictions, depression, anxiety. All of these things can come from unprocessed grief. So then why don't we grieve? Well, I thought of 4 reasons. One is cultural. It is not cultural to grieve, to be sad, right? We are taught and encouraged to avoid all of those kinds of emotions like sadness, fear, despair, frustration, disillusionment, all that. We don't really want to feel that. We want to leave it to the side. And so culturally, grief isn't so acceptable. Second reason, grief plunges us into our emotions and into silence. Why do things happen? And we are uncomfortable with emotions and with silence. God is not, but we are. And so It's just easier not to do that. Third reason, we don't slow down enough. We don't slow down long enough to pay attention, to allow these losses to be the place of self-knowledge and transformation. We think it's more productive to get on with our life. Okay. I need to just stop sitting around and get going to my next thing. Fourth, we don't know how. We don't know what to do with it. And so, since we don't know what to do with it, we just let it go. We have translated a set of books on grief here at Christ Church that give a guide for how to process grief. Ask me about those books afterwards if you're interested. Here's what the author of this course that we're doing, this workshop that we're doing at Christ Church called Pete Scazzaro, here's what he says about grief and loss. In our culture, addiction has become the most common way to deal with pain. We watch television incessantly. We keep busy, running from one activity to another. We work 70 hours a week, indulge in pornography, overeat, drink, take pills, anything to help us avoid the pain. Some of us demand that someone or something, a marriage, a sexual partner, an ideal family, children, an achievement, a career, or a church, take our loneliness away. But sadly, the result of denying and minimizing our wounds over many years is that we become less and less human. We become empty Christian shells with painted smiley faces. For some, a dull, low-level depression descends upon us, making us nearly unresponsive to all reality. Do you know someone like that? Are you someone like that? This is what happens when we don't engage with our losses. I want to see, in contrast, what Jesus' response is to grief and loss. In the book of Luke, chapter 7, Jesus comes across a group of people that's in grief. It says Jesus went to a town called Nain, and his disciples and a large crowd went along with him. As he approached the town gate, a dead person was being carried out, the only son of his mother, and she was a widow. And a large crowd from the town was with her. When the Lord saw her, his heart went out to her, and he said, "Don't cry." Then he went up and touched the bier they were carrying him on, and the bearers stood still. He said, "Young man, I say to you, get up." The dead man sat up and began to talk, and Jesus gave him back to his mother. They were all filled with awe and praised God. "A great prophet has appeared among us," they said. "God has come to help his people." This news about Jesus spread throughout Judea and the surrounding country. What do you notice about Jesus? In our CBSI Bible studies, we learn to observe. The first thing we do in any passage that we read is observe. What do you notice? I noticed that there were many disciples with Jesus and a large crowd. He was walking with a big group of people, and they came to this town. And out of the town, another big group of people came, and they were all sad. They were there to be with this woman who was a widow and had just lost her only son. Imagine that sadness. Imagine that loneliness. She was a widow. She had already lived through the death of her husband. And it says there were many people with her. Actually, it says a large crowd. I think she was probably a good friend. And I wonder if the grief of having lost her husband had softened her, had done its work, had given her the wisdom of humility and acceptance that made her such a gift to other people. Jesus' response is compassion. His heart went out to her, it says. Oh, I'm so sorry. I can just hear him say that. And he said, don't cry. Do you think he was telling her to deny her emotions? No, I don't think so. I think he was acknowledging her emotions and giving her hope. Jesus was present. He was present with the widow. He was present with the dead man. He walked up and stopped the procession. And he was present with the whole crowd. Jesus' presence changes everything. Jesus' presence changes everything. What if he had not brought the son back to life? I think we might still read the story in the Bible. Jesus says, young man, I say to you, get up. And the young man sat up and began to talk. I wonder what he was saying. What did he say? Where had he been? And what was that like to come back? Why does it say he sat up and began to talk? So interesting. Maybe he said, thank you, Jesus. Thank you for giving me another chance. And then it says, Jesus gave him back to his mother. So interesting. Jesus gave him back like he was Jesus. He belonged to Jesus, and Jesus gave him back to his mother. The result is that all were filled with awe. The huge crowd that was with Jesus, all of his disciples, the huge crowd from the town, the widow who had just received her son back, and her son. All of them were filled with awe, praised God, spread the news. They said, a great prophet has come. God has come to help his people. What a faith-inspiring moment that was. From a sad, despairing moment to a faith-inspiring moment. That's what only God can do. In God's presence, there are always good purposes beyond our current experience. In God's presence, there are always good purposes beyond our current experience for others and for ourselves. We are still reading and still learning from this story today, thousands of years later. At another moment, Jesus is present with Mary and Martha when their brother Lazarus had died. You remember that story? And look what Jesus says to Mary and Martha. Did I not tell you that if you believe, you will see the glory of God? Don't you know that? Don't you know that the glory of God, seeing the glory of God, depends on you, on your faith, on your openness, on your ability to integrate these things? Well, what? What are we supposed to believe? What is Jesus meaning? Jesus is inviting us, them, and us into a spiritual reality through belief that values the process more than the product. This is what we sing, the upside down kingdom. Jesus invites us to be part of an upside down kingdom. In the spiritual reality, the process is more important than the product. The spiritual reality is a simultaneous reality to ours right now. Believe what? Believe that God is present, just like Jesus was present in that moment. Believe that God has good purposes. Believe that He will help us. He will. Believe that this life is not all there is. Maybe that's what the son was talking about. Oh, you can't imagine where I just was. This place is amazing. I don't know. This life is not all there is. Believe that His promises are more real than our circumstances. And so loss marks the place where self-knowledge and powerful transformation happen if we have the courage to participate fully in the process. Are you willing to believe? Are you willing to try to believe? The songs that we sang this morning are written by people who've already jumped that hurdle. They're already believing. And so many of the words we sang this morning are hard for someone to sing who hasn't gotten over there to that side, who doesn't yet believe. But it's possible. And it's the place where self-knowledge and powerful transformation happen. Because our suffering draws us closer to God. I read an article this week by our friend Rosanna Basile, and she wrote that. This is what we can believe. There's a purpose to our suffering. Our suffering draws us closer to God. God is present, just like Jesus was present. He came to show us what God is like. That's why Jesus came to this earth, to let us see with our eyes and touch with our hands and understand how He is. Now, we don't have the privilege of having Jesus show up, but we do have the privilege of having Jesus show up in our lives. And this is what we can believe. God is present, and He wants us to draw closer to God. Suffering and death bring resurrection and transformation. This is one of those oxymorons that God loves so much. Suffering and death bring resurrection and transformation. That's from the book by Pete Scazzaro called Emotionally Healthy Spirituality. So how can we grieve well? First, we must slow down. You can't grieve well if you're living your life in a hurry. So slow down. And as you slow down, pay attention. Pay attention to what's going on inside you, to what your emotions are, because your emotions are. You don't dictate your emotions. Your emotions just happen. And emotions aren't negative or bad. They are neutral, even if they're uncomfortable. We can say, oh, I don't like that emotion. But that doesn't mean it's a bad emotion. Pay attention to what's happening inside us. Pay attention to what's happening around us as we're paying attention to what's happening inside of us. Slow down so that we can wait in the confusing in between. Loss, death, limits, all of these things are very confusing to us. We want life to just flow and be easy and go ahead, and when it's not, it's very confusing. And we're called to wait. We're called to accept our limits and become humble. When we accept our limits, we become humble. When we say, I wish I could do more, and I actually can't. It's very hard for me to say that. Accept our limits and become humble while we wait in the confusing in between. And thirdly, let the old birth the new. Let it happen. This is what God is all about. Our loss and our grief is the place of resurrection and transformation. Look at those words. Pay attention, wait, let. Those are all passive words. We're not expected to take action. We're not expected to make something happen. We're invited to accept God's work in us with a humility that knows we are not in control. We are not in control. We like to think we're in control. We like to try to be in control, but we're not. One thing can happen, and we lose our sense of control. And so God says, even as you rightfully grieve, I plant the seeds of new life. My end is not death. It is always life. I am the Lord of life. Will you believe me for this? The seeds die when they're planted, but they give birth to the new life of these plants. God says, even as you rightfully grieve the deaths, I plant the seeds of new life. My end is not death. It is always life. I am the Lord of life. Will you believe me for this?